Right, well, I know there was a paper on Yevering yesterday, and there are people here who know so much more about it than I do. But when I read Gabor's description of what we should be doing, I once thought, well, what can I do as a historian? And this is what I'm approaching with is not necessarily a sort of total picture, although I am sort of obviously using some archaeological evidence. But I'm trying to think how does a historian approach this? What are the written sources actually indicating? And of course, one of the very interesting things we have is that we not only got Yevering, but we've also got Millfield, or which is probably Melvin from Camden's time. It's been assumed that it's Millfield. We have got this very interesting statement from Bede that Yevering was left deserted in the times of the kings who followed Edwin, and another was built instead in a place called Malmin. And this is obviously interesting because it is a very rare statement of one place being deliberately abandoned, apparently, and another being built nearby. Because we know, although Yevering seems to have been burnt down at one stage, it was rebuilt, and then it was abandoned, or at least, was it all abandoned? I mean, I know there are discussions about whether the church might have continued for longer, but obviously Bede's concentrating on the fact that it's some sort of very significant royal centre and it's been deliberately abandoned. And it does seem to be an implication in what he's saying that it's because of dynastic change. Edwin, of course, was from a deer and royal house, and the kings who followed him were Venetians from northern Northumbria. So I think there is an implication here that there might be a deliberate move because of dynastic change. That's one of the themes that's going to crop up in other things that I'm saying. And the other interesting implication is that Bede knew this had happened, although this is some time before he wrote in 731. It was a century before, and yet he knows the names of these places, and he knows what sort of place they were and the history that's happened to them. And so there is a implication here perhaps of oral history, remembering what has happened here. So in other words, if this is to mark dynastic change, it's worked in the sense that people are seeing there is this sharp division that's taken place, that it might be reflected in the names. Obviously, what is particularly interesting is that Yevering and Millfield are actually fairly close together, but they are on different rivers, River Glen and River Till respectively, rising into the Cheviots and draining into Tweed, and that there are other sites nearby in a similar position, Spruceton and Melrose, that also seem to be places that have British names and are arguably some sort of royal centres, and you could see how these might work for different river valleys. But Yevering does seem to be more than just that in all the unusual things that we know about it. So I'm not going to go into the Yevering evidence in any detail, but I do just want to pick out four main points about it, which are going to crop up in other things I'm talking about. First of all, it's been identified as a royal residence, a royal ville, which is what we're all concerned with. From Bede's account, it would appear to have been a place of assembly. I mean, I'm not saying tying this to any particular region or types of assembly, but just that his account of what happened there suggests that a lot of people have come together. And the excavations, and perhaps some of the things that Bede said, suggest that a religious element is important. There's a ritual going on at the site. First pagan, probably, and then Christian, and that there might be a very clear demonstration intended that a Christian ritual has taken the place of pagan. And then there might also be an implication through other types of sites that we know about, that this collection of dues, royal payments, that this is the sort of thing that might be going on at a site like this. So there may be other sites as well. So Yevering, perhaps unusual number of things that are happening in one place, not necessarily all at exactly the same point in the site. This is always problems when we have excavations that obviously only a small part of the site has been excavated. So Yevering and Malvin, that shows up the idea of shifting sites, but of course not all sites shift. And one very long one is Bamborough. So I'm not saying any more about that, but just that I'm not saying that all sites have to be abandoned and changed. Some are just too important to do that, or they've got uses that come in at other periods. And I'm sorry this isn't a very good map, but I had trouble finding a good map. But this is just another way of approaching the subject from Somerset. And I've highlighted 4 different centres that have evidence, or have elements of what one might look for royal sites, and how they might reflect different periods. So I started off with the, I don't think I've got there, anyway, at the bottom there, the Roman site of Ilchester. And then we have the site of South Cadbury, which reused Hillfort. We all know that Alcock's excavations there suggest it was reused in the 5th, 6th centuries, and possibly implications of British power at that time. But the Anglo-Saxon centre in the area is the one in the middle, Somerton, which gave its name to Somerset and was is described as a royal villa. We know a number of things that went on at Somerton when Ethelwald of Mercia was imposing his overlordship of Wessex. It was Somerton that he took as a sign of that. And then to the left of Somerton we have Langport, which was the birth site of the Burgle Highditch. And I'm not suggesting Somerton is abandoned for Langport, but rather that Langport is added in as a site that is needed. But then a full cycle would be to go back to South Cadbury again, because we know that South Cadbury was one of the emergency burghs brought in the reign of Ethelred. And you can see what a very dominant site it is as a hill fort, and you can see why it might be the sort of site that would appear. I mean, so one might think of this like Bamborough as a site you couldn't possibly do without. But of course, if you've been to South Cadbury, you know it's for everyday living. It's really very inconvenient because it's extremely steep. And you can also see that Somerton might be a much more practical place to have, and you could still say that Cadbury is part of your control. But as a defended site, it's obviously of importance, but it's quite a big site to defend, which may be why Langport was chosen instead. This is an example of a different sort of thing, shifting round in a region, within a region, perhaps reflecting the needs of different periods. So we think of the Roman town being one sort of site. Obviously, the Anglo-Saxons had the option of going back to Ilchester, as they did with other Roman towns, but for some reason that was not taken, and Somerton was felt to be a more significant site, although it's very hard to say why Somerton was. And there is nothing, if you go to Somerton, there's nothing there that obviously relates to the Anglo-Saxon period. But what's also interesting is the name of Cadbury, because there are 2 other Cadbury hill forts in Somerset, and there are other names with Cadder in, which is also a British name meaning battle, that is found in the name of some of the West Saxon kings. So you do wonder that South Cadbury, which had been a British centre, and now has this name which references the British past, but also possibly the West Saxon royal house. Whether again we've got a sort of oral history that has been lost to do with some cheddar or else some battle victory that's being celebrated at these sites. So although when we get to Ethelred II's reign, Ethelred the Unready's reign, when this site was reused, often by then people are saying, oh, well, this is a more sophisticated government, etc., etc. But, I mean, one of the other emergency burghs brought in by Ethelred is Sisbury in Sussex, which has also got the name Sissa, which crops up in connections with the West Saxon royal house, and could be seen as a similar sort of site. So is there a deliberate evocation going on here by the unsuccessful Ethelred to try and resurrects West Saxon successes of the past, or to refer back to these sites. So these are an example of sort of shifting sites in a rather different way, and some of which are only sort of temporary abandoned and may come back in, but also different cultures, different needs. So I've been trying to think, are there other types of sites where one could see a sort of shifting of Malmin and Yevering? And I haven't got any other explicit statements like that, but looking in a different way, I can find in the historical record signs of dynastic change leading to favoritism of particular sites. There may be some downgrading of other sites, but that's often more difficult to tell, and the site might continue at a sort of quieter level. So I picked out one here, the religious houses and the patronage of Mercian kings in the late 7th to early 9th century. Many of these, as you can see, are royal nunneries, which are something I'll be coming back to. But we've got here Wulfhere and Ethelred, who are brothers, but they have different sites. Hanbury is associated with the daughter of Wulfhere, Ethelred himself a founder of Bardney, and that's the only one. He went into this as a monk himself, and that's the only one that's not a female religious house. And then Ethelbald is a completely different branch of the Mercian house, and Offa is from that same branch as well, but not very closely related to Ethelbald. They're fairly distant cousins. And Comus is a different branch again. And you can see each one has favoured a different royal nunnery in which they've installed their own female relatives. In many cases they are buried at these places, like Ethelbald is buried at Repton and Offa is buried at Bedford, and probably Ethelred's at Barnby, but etc. So this is a slightly different way of marking that, but it does suggest that different dynasties or different individuals might want to have some places that are specially theirs and that are leaving their reputation, that are, of course, looking after their souls, but also perhaps after their reputations, and are going to be a visible thing in the landscape. So that's from the sort of written sources, sort of one of the ways that I could approach that. And going slightly later, look at burial places of the kings of Wessex, where we've going out of the period here, but this is because there's a better run of evidence for this time as well. And you've got the same sort of thing going on, though, and something else, of course, that's often talked about for archaeological sites, how sometimes people want to reference an earlier reign and an individual, and I could have cited Repton for that as well, where several different kings of different dynasties are buried, but it crops up here as well. I haven't been able to give all the relationships of these people, but you can see Ethelwulf is the sort of father figure here, and Ethelbald, Ethelbert and Ethelred are his sons, and two of them, as you say, are buried in one of the bishoprics of the West Saxons at Sherborne, but Ethelred has gone for another nunnery in the Mercian tradition that's not used quite so much in Wessex. But then with Alfred, and really through his son Edward, a brand new burial place for the dynasty is founded, Newminster in Winchester. And Edward has Alfred buried there, moved out of the Old Minster into Newminster, and also very members of the family who die there during his reign are buried there. But when he dies, there is a dispute between his sons by two marriages, and Winchester backs, as it were, the wrong horse, who dies young, and Athelstan, who'd been the rejected son, as it were, becomes king. And so we find him going back to another religious house that has a long association with the royal family, and indeed founded originally, first Abbot Aldhelm and Saint was a member of the royal family in Malmesbury. And then Edmund, who succeeds him, is his half-brother. And he does die unexpectedly quite close to Glastonbury, but he goes back to yet another religious house that has a very long tradition. You all know Glastonbury, Reading, connection with writing up of Glastonbury, etc., etc. And then you've got the brother of Edmund going back to Oldminster. We've got the eldest son of Edmund buried at Newminster, and then we've got Edgar, not in spite of his patronage of Winchester, that going back to Glastonbury where his father was buried. Now, there's really quite complex things here, and one can go into some detail. I've probably gone too much detail already about the political history, but possible parallels here, possible thing of how kings behave, of how sometimes they want to relate to individuals, some of whom are close relatives, sometimes the complete opposite. So it's not just dynastic change, it's also rivalry within dynasties. And I did, when I was preparing this, think about the question of royal itineraries. David Hill's Atlas of Anglo-Saxon England you've been familiar with. And there are places that frequently recur there where kings go several times, but also for any reign there are some that only occur once. So we've got up there in Edward the Elder's itinerary, Bickley in Devon, which is actually identified as a hunting lodge. One of recognition of a particular type of royal site. And that's the only time it appears. So is it one that's particularly associated with Edward, or? But I decided there are just too many sites that only appear once to really say, is this a particular king's favourite residence? But you do notice that there are some sites that regularly appear, and some that do appear only once, and that may just be chance of kings moving around the landscape, or it may be telling us something else. Anyway, some of these sites are going to come up, but I couldn't produce a sort of idea, another sort of Yevering and Melvin to say definitely, one king's going here and another king's going there. So another familiar site you'll have thought about, and so this is again to another sort of shifting settlement which written sources help us with, understanding a site of royal residence that apparently takes on another or a different type of use. So Lyminge, which you all know very well, if you've been hearing about, we've got the halls in the foreground, and we see the church behind. And of course this is, and some of the other Kentish sites, but particularly Lyminge, has become very interesting because you've got undocumented use as an early royal site, and then you have documented use as ecclesiastical site, probably a royal nunnery. But you also notice there's a geographical difference here. And if you took the whole of Lyminge, it's really quite a big area where lots of different things could be happening at one time. I think Lyminge is very interesting to ask some of those questions that I suggest about Yevering and its functions, and really to ask what aspects of the site might be shifting when the royal nunnery is founded. And one of these questions is, of course, the religious provision. Is this what was important at sites like Yevering and Lyminge? Was it how important was any ritual circumstance that was going there? And because that's one obvious thing that's also taking place at the royal nunnery. And I should say that the sites in Kent in particular suggest that there are very strong kings are intending to keep control of the royal nunneries and seeing them as much part of their suite of places as in a separate category, rather than being in a separate category of church. So these are obviously there to help look after the religious interests of kings, but not just of kings. That's one reason why there's a double foundations. They have priests and they're looking after the local area as well. So that's one type of thing. Another question I ask about residence. Has that in fact disappeared? Because of course we know that kings often did stay at ecclesiastical sites. And so when they thought of Lyminge, did they think of it, oh, this is our church? Or did they think of it, oh, this is our residence we always come to, and it just happens to have a church now? And of course, where kings stayed is not necessarily going to be the same site as where the nuns are living. There's plenty of room. So what I need to know from Gabor is whether there is any sign of a residence in which kings might have stayed But of course, they didn't necessarily need a grand residence. I mean, they could have moved out the priests and taken over their residence when they came to a site. So, again, a point that people have, that has often been made, that at somewhere like Wearmouth and Jarrow, the stone buildings that seem to have been used as refectory and dormitory resemble in stone the sort of scale of a sort of timber building like Yevering. It's a reminder that, you know, these and Jarrow is definitely a royal foundation, perhaps very closely associated with King Ecgfrith, as Ian Wood has argued, that originally not intended as a sort of sister foundation to Wearmouth, but perhaps very much as Ecgfrith's church, and that their very interesting documentation from Jarrow suggests that there is a sharp change in its fortunes when it does become associated with Wearmouth, which may again be linked with dynastic change and the disappearance, or Ecgfrith doesn't have a direct successor as king. Again, a half-brother succeeds, who's got rather different ideas and ways of doing things. So this sort of emphasises, I mean, and again, a rather finely furnished building down by the waterfront's been suggested maybe a place where kings could stay when they visited Wearmouth and Jarrow. So an idea that religious foundation isn't removing this from being a royal residence in the sense of somewhere that kings might stay. And then another site I'm sure you've been hearing something about, but another point that I didn't raise directly so much with Yevering, but I did raise with the Somerset sites, the idea of cultural associations that many people have said. There is some of the early Anglo-Saxon royal residences are definitely situating themselves in landscapes that are very busy and have links with the past, and that they want to make those links. But as we've seen, that's not always the case, as there might be the case with South Cadbury, a rejection of that royal site initially, and one that's perhaps better suited for Anglo-Saxon needs. So in that period when elites are establishing themselves, we have a strong statement of Germanic links on the one hand, links with Scandinavia perhaps, or links with the British world. But after conversion, they're really the referencing is going in a rather different direction to Roman, Frankish, Western European cultural links. I'm not saying that there's a direct desire to live as the Romans did, because far more Roman towns would have come back into use then. Ilchester wasn't a site that the Anglo-Saxons wanted to use, but they did choose a Freshfield site. But obviously some towns do come back in there, and there is, I think, sort of cultural change is being referenced. And this reconstruction of Canterbury, of course, picks out the amphitheatre, and I don't need to tell you about the grandstand fragment at Yevering, but a number of sites that kings are associated with have got amphitheatres, and it is interesting to think that these are areas of very clear cultural statement, but also very useful if you're having an assembly, which does take place at some of these sites. And then we have the whole problem, which John Blair has very interestingly discussed, about the problem of a royal ecclesiastical dichotomy, and whether some sites should be classed sometimes as royal and some as ecclesiastical, and indicators of taking back of the king of various royal sites. And I think undoubtedly this does go on, but one does have to be careful with some of the historical evidence for this. And a sort of Abingdon it became a very famous site under Ethelwald, but also a site that seems to rather imaginatively discuss some of its past. And Susan Kelly, looking at the charters for the area, suggests that in fact Abingdon wasn't such a significant minster. That some of the charters that appear to give Abingdon's history are in fact talking about a different site, and that Ethelwald deliberately wanted to concoct a history taking it back as a religious site to the Bedean period, which is so keen. So this 12th century evidence may be a bit suspect because it comes from the Ethelwald tradition, but it does indicate that what might go on is a sort of shifting in priority at various times. But it does seem to be the case that many sites that we might cast as royal villas did have important churches, and that sometimes they may have been frequently used as a royal site, and the evidence we have is their royal use, and they get classed more as royal sites. In other cases, we might have more references to them being ecclesiastical site, and so they tend to get labelled on that side. But in fact, the division might not be as clear as that. And very briefly, these are 4 sites, probably similar in date and reflecting sort of changes that taking place in the late 8th, early 9th century, with great emphasis on wanting to have choirs. And Canterbury Cathedral, we know, belongs to the Archbishop Deerhurst. We know it belongs to a Ealdormanic family, a very important Ealdormanic family. Brixworth and Cirencester are more difficult to class, but Cirencester in particular is a very interesting site. It had a major church, as has been excavated, but there's very little written evidence about that church. On the other hand, we do have quite a lot of evidence for Cirencester being used as a royal site. It's a place of early battles. It's a place where charters were granted in 935, 956 and 985. It was the place to which Guthrum, in alliance with Alfred, withdrew after he'd made his peace with him. So Cirencester, and of course it's a Roman town, mustn't forget that. And it's one of these Roman town sites with particularly noticeable amphitheatre as well. So how do you class Cirencester? And I think there are a number of sites which are quite difficult to class, and John has drawn attention to some of these. But I think Northampton and Cheddar, and I think these are both places that are could have been royal residences or used by kings, and they've got significant churches. And I do agree with John that Cheddar is probably. I do think that the West Saxon kings in Alfred's family were quite keen to take over places that had been associated with earlier Anglo-Saxon kings not closely related to them. And that there's places like Cheddar might be a good example of that sort of thing. But Northampton perhaps belongs to a slightly different type of site, a grander site, and John's provided a very interesting parallel with Frankfurt. I'm not quite sure you're going. I mean, but that's this equal balance in some way. That this might be a new type of royal site, or a site that's developing from the sort of mid-8th century onwards. So I'll just very briefly say some more about in a moment. Sorry, I must hurry up. It's picked out here in connection with those sort of new sites that are developing, where West Saxon charters are issued at royal villas between 838 and 871. Again, I haven't got earlier evidence that I can use here. I tried to pick out that keeps recurring, and which we might refer to as a shire town, or which subsequently becomes shire town. This is the period when we do have references to shires in Wessex, and you can see that there's a number of royal sites. It's interesting to see Sutton Courtenay coming back in here. Another example of a site that's perhaps shifted rather than disappeared altogether. But you do see a number of those occurring. And in this other... Oh no, I haven't got that. It must be coming up in a moment. And I do think there are also comparable sites in Mercia, but they don't become the shires, because the shires of Mercia are a later, sort of late 10th century, in fact even 11th century in some cases, position. So in Mercia they're rather Seaton districts, and that's also a term that the West Saxons use for Somerseaton, Wiltseaton. And I do think that Northampton, Tamworth, these may be similar sorts of site. I'm not going to call them urban, which of course is what they're sometimes called. I would rather see them as a prestige royal vill. perhaps the equivalent of Yevering in many ways at a slightly later point. And what's also interesting is that the latest work on Stafford has suggested that it may be very like Tamworth in appearance, with this idea of a sort of palace enclosure with the church in it. Now obviously you could interpret that differently as a church enclosure, so I'm not saying it has to be interpreted that way, but I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it. And Tamworth is a good example of a site that's used for some important royal occasions, wedding of Athelstan's sister, for instance. So there's sites like this on Chippenham, which is another one that's used for royal weddings. These had to have an important church in them, but there's enough evidence to suggest they are classed as royal sites as well. And just an interesting pattern to bring out here from Wessex of charters issued on St Stephen's Day, Boxing Day, as we call it, at Royal Vills. And this is, of course, an important royal occasion in later centuries when gifts were actually given. And you see Dorchester has appeared 3 times there. And Dorchester does seem to be a very favoured site in this part of the 9th century. And, of course, Dorchester also has an amphitheatre. Well, it began as a henge, so you can have your prehistoric Roman and then Anglo-Saxon and eventually Civil War uses as well. So there's a shifting in the sense that new types of site are developing, perhaps new requirements, new expectations from kings of what church sites should look like. And of course, what's happening in Francia and sort of huge developments under the Carolingians, or also perhaps affecting the type of site that Anglo-Saxon kings want to develop. So that's more or less finished. I just wanted to say that one thing you could see from the later evidence is just how many different types of sites are used and how it's very difficult to get a pattern. So this is a recent study by Levi Roach, and you can see places of legislative assembly, that is either when law codes were issued. And on the other side he's got dispositive assemblies, that is places that are named in charters as places where they're issued. And there's very little overlap between them. Although you might think there's a sort of major assembly where you issue laws might be a similar occasion to where you issue charters. And I know there's been some interesting discussion from Carolingian evidence about the significance of places where charters are issued. So I just put that up really to show some of the difficulties here. And just one other thought, one of the other things we can have from the written sources are these famous farms of one night that were still surviving, but perhaps often with some regrouping in Domesday Book. And this is just Ryan Lavell's reconstruction of the Dorset ones. And you can see at Dorchester and Fordington, I should have said with Dorchester, this is one of these sites where there are several different places that seem to be involved within the circuit of Dorchester, not just the town of Dorchester, but the Maunbury Rings is on one side of Dorchester. Fordington, which seems to be the most significant church, interestingly dedicated to St George probably from quite an early date, is on the other side of town. And that is somewhere where kings are going. But often many of these other royal sites, no king is known to have visited them. And if you look at the farms of one night, where you might think with itinerant kingship, kings are supposed to turn up to eat their way through their food. In fact, there's rather a lot of farms one night where no king is known to have gone. So I'm just not offering a solution there, but I'm just sort of trying to indicate some of the possibilities from written sources for parallels and contrast with archaeological interpretations. Thank you.